Good morning. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for including me in the very first iteration of this conference. What an incredible honor. So this morning what I want to talk about is harnessing disruption in the era of artificial intelligence. We keep hearing AI, 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 and sometimes we hear about it as if it's going to like cure all sorts of stuff, and then other people say, oh no, it's going to completely take over our profession. And so I think the truth lies somewhere in between. And so as an audience of internal auditors, one of the things I want to talk about is disruption in general. Is that better? Okay. One of the things I want to talk about is disruption in general, but with a focus on artificial intelligence. So one of the things about disruption, when we think about the word disruption, we often associate that with something that's very bad or traumatic. But in fact, when we think about business opportunities, some of the biggest things in our organizational ability to leap ahead is often inspired by disruption. And so when we think about artificial intelligence as a disruptor, we also have to think about it as something that is a potential opportunity. So I want to talk about harnessing the power of disruption. And as an internal audit profession, what are some of the things that we can do? I loved Benito's comments on the panel session earlier when he talked about independence and looking at, coming up with a governance framework coming from the IIA. A lot of times we cloak ourselves in sort of this shroud of independence, but it often becomes overused and we become separate, so separate and apart from the business that we're supporting, that sometimes I think that we may lose a little bit of our effectiveness. And so I want to think about harnessing disruption from an audit lens. And then the next area I would get into is resilience. So regardless of the disruption that we're facing, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's cyber, whether it's geopolitical events, what are some of the things that we as internal auditors can do to help our organization to really prepare for disruption and be resilient? And then lastly, I'll go over some of the things that we can do as an internal audit function to actually leverage artificial intelligence to make us more effective auditors. So when you think about the last handful of years, if we could all go back in time and talk to the 2019 versions of ourselves, would we have ever imagined, we've all lived through COVID and some of the things that are going on across the world, would have ever imagined in 2019 that so many of us across the globe would have been sheltered in our homes and not really understanding when, if we were going to emerge from that and what society would look like after that. We have lived through unprecedented levels of disruption. And we look through some of these photos here, there's, the COVID, the pictures there. These are all coming out of, international news photos. The picture of the little boy at the top. Many of us, I'm not sure how it was handled in Egypt, but I know in the United States, as a parent myself, we suddenly went from being a worker, somebody going to an office every day, to suddenly I was having my children at home and having to provide them education every single day while also performing my work duties. It was incredibly disruptive to not only my children, to all of us. And so we all went through that. I don't know that we could have ever thought that we could have gotten through it, but we did. When you think about some of the geopolitical events and some of the weather events. I know in the U.S., the state of California, with so many natural disasters and fires, and how do organizations how do they become resilient after one of these natural disasters? And then, of course, if you've ever seen me speak, my background's heavy cybersecurity, and so I tend to fixate on cybersecurity in many of my speeches. I'm not going to hit cyber too hard in this speech, but obviously in the headlines you see things like ransomware, nation-state sponsored types of attacks, one country against another country embedding themselves in their infrastructure. And so how do we think about disruption through those types of lenses? So disruption, let's see. So here are some corporate logos, and I'm not sure, I'm hoping that they translate across international boundaries. I'm hoping most of them will. But when you think about disruption in terms of through just strategic disruption, so Amazon, I can remember when Amazon first came out onto the scene, they were going to sell books on the internet. And at the time, I'm dating myself, but this was the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I thought, who in the world is going to buy a book on the internet? I mean, it was like, what is that? Of course you're going to go to a bookstore and you want to see the book and you want to hear the book when you open it and the smell of the pages. And we all know what that looks like now. So not only did Amazon disrupt the book industry, but Amazon, they sell food. They sell every possible thing you can imagine. They're selling that, and they've disrupted so many industries. When we think about in the U.S., we had a company, and all through the 1980s, 1990s, called Blockbuster, and that's where we would go and get your VHS tapes on a Friday night to hang out with your family. And when Netflix first came around, this is even before they were a streaming service, you would get DVDs sent to you in the mail. And at the time, people thought, oh, isn't that interesting? A DVD in the mail, who in the world is going to do that? And so we know how that's turned out. It's funny that Blockbuster is still in business. They have one store left. It's in Oregon, out in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. But that went from being such a massive, recognized label to something that's one store in a little state out in the wilderness in Oregon in the U.S. When you think about the taxi industry, our slide went to sleep. There we go. When you think about the cab industry, so if you've ever gone to any major city anywhere in the world, you always are going to see taxis everywhere. And for me, spending a lot of time in Washington D.C. or New York City, one of the hallmark things in New York City is the yellow taxi cab, and you can see them all over the street. And when it went to a model where suddenly you could call up a ride on your phone through an app, and you were going to get into a car with a stranger, the first time that became knowledge to me, I thought, who in the world's going to do that? You're just going to get in a car with some random stranger, you're going to dial them up on your app. And now pretty much we all do that, and we find it a lot more convenient than hailing a taxi cab, because we know exactly where they're going to be, we can order them in advance. But they had such a disruptive influence in that entire industry. I worked for the U.S. Congress for 19 years, nonpartisan. I'm not political, but as a nonpartisan, I was the Inspector General of the U.S. House of Representatives, and so that's essentially like the head of audit there. But in any event, when I think about disruption of going from landline telephones to all of us being on our cell phones, that's had such a disruptive impact on the ability of politicians to do surveys and to figure out, who's going to vote for me, and to get real good poll data before going into a national election. And so it's this absolutely disrupted that world. And of course, and one of the other last picture is when you think about those of us who grew up with hard copy newspapers, there's nothing better than getting that newspaper, at the end of your driveway at your home or in front of your hotel room door. And at this point, most of us are looking at our newspapers online and on our phone or our tablet. And so the disruption in that business model has been one where if they don't learn how to adapt, they're going to go out of business. And so as we think about disruption, we don't ever want to be the blockbuster. We don't ever want to be the one going out of business. And so as internal auditors, we also have a role in trying to help our organizations to think about what's our Amazon competitor, what's our Uber competitor, what is the thing that's going to disrupt us where we are no longer relevant. So Anthony had used a very similar slide the other day. What I think is so terrific about this slide is when you think about impact of users. So when you think about time to reach 1 million users, Netflix, 3.5 years, and you can see the time graph. ChatGPT, 5 days. 5 days, and it had over 1 million users. So obviously we know that ChatGPT, whether we like it or not, is going to be disruptive. So what are we going to do about it? So when you think about ChatGPT in the free version, so fastest adopted technology in human history. And so when you look around, people, organizations are thinking, how do I harness ChatGPT so that way I can really leapfrog, hop over my competitors to really harness the power here. And a lot of organizations are completely rethinking, well, how do I do business? Because they want to get ahead. But when you think about the original version of ChatGPT, they're refining it. From when it first hit the scenes, about a year and a half ago, when it first hit the scenes, it was literally based on a research program. Some researchers came together and they came up with ChatGPT, and you have entire companies who are redesigning the way that they do their entire business based on something that was just a research project. It was never envisioned for what people are using it for. The other thing is that the original version, it was limited to 2021 data. So if anything happened the day after the first version of ChatGPT came out, it was not in the training data. And so I don't know that a lot of people, as they were starting to implement the first version of ChatGPT, I don't think they understood that. That if they were looking for something, I think they looked at ChatGPT, the initial one. I'm not picking on ChatGPT. This could be with any large language model. But when they looked at that very first version, I think a lot of users thought it was like a magic box where you put a question in and you shake it and a magic answer came out. When in fact, there's a lot of limitations to it. And so as auditors, we want to make sure that we really understand what are we opting into before we start redesigning our entire business strategy. So when you think about large language models, generative AI, they're capable of creating novel content. So what does that mean? So it means they're very creative. And so now when they've added in things like graphics, you can put anything in there. Give me a picture of a dinosaur wearing a Santa Claus hat, or give me a picture of, there we go. Give me a picture of, whatever. It's very, very creative. It's trained on large, volumes of public data. And they have layered on basic controls on top of it. So those of us, we're internal auditors, we're always wondering, okay, what controls are in place to make sure that you can't use this for bad? So basic controls are, with the, with some of these large language models is, you can't put in there, can you tell me how to create a bomb, or can you tell me how to create, to create my own weapon or something? They have controls in place to prevent you from being able to do those very straightforward commands. But it's very sort of basic types of controls in place that are layered on top. But you can trick it, and there's been lots of different ways that they've shown where you can actually trick the large language model to give you an answer that it's not supposed to give you. For example, if you use double negatives, so in English it would be, how do I not do this? Gets confusing. and you can confuse the AI into giving you something that it's not supposed to give you. And they've actually, it was last September, October timeframe, one of the really old U.S. universities, one of the Ivy Leagues, very prestigious university, had run a contest with people who could do script injections with their AI to try to trick it and to give it the password. And so it was open to everybody, all these contestants, all these students across the entire United States, to try to come up with ways to trick the AI. And people were getting really smart about it. And so just understand, so if you can trick an AI to give it something you're not supposed to give it, think about that in the context of your business model. So you want to make sure that you're not putting stuff in an AI that's publicly facing, that somebody can use it to be able to coax out of it information that you don't want in the public space. So when you look around the news, and these are just headlines that I pulled off the internet about companies that have fully adopted large language model AI in customer-facing, public-facing types of roles. And so in yesterday's Anthony's presentation, he talked about one of the largest sectors to use artificial intelligence is in nonprofits, and that they're actually using it to replace staff. And I would suspect that that's happening because in nonprofits, they're going to be a little more limited on money. And so they're going to look for opportunities to be able to use AI as a tool so that way they can reduce operating expenses. The problem with that, if you're not careful about how you're using it, bad things can happen. So for example, in this particular article, there was a nonprofit, and this one was based, I think, in the UK, where they had sacked, fired, terminated all these employees who used to answer the telephone for people calling in who had eating disorders. And the people calling in might be in a crisis with an eating disorder. And they replaced the humans with artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence was giving the people with eating disorders advice about going on diets, which is the exact opposite of what you should be doing with people in this particular type of mental health condition. And so as a result, it was giving really bad advice to people who were in bad mental health situations that went exactly opposite of the goal of this organization. And so as we deploy artificial intelligence, we just need to be thoughtful about, are we doing this in a public-facing way? Do we really want this AI to be the face or the voice of our organization? So for example, unsupervised automation. So a lot of companies, what they're doing is that they'll call it machine-human teaming, or co-piloting is another term. And what that means is that you can use AI, but you want to make sure that there's a human there to be there to make sure that they're not saying something that's inappropriate or something that's going to get your organization in a publicity, problem. And so the other thing is that if you have a human there, they'll also be able to look sure at the output, because when you're buying an AI off of the shelf, you don't really know what data it's been trained on. I mean, it's very expensive to develop your own large language model where you control all the data, you know exactly what it's been trained on. But to be able to do that, you're talking petabytes and petabytes of data. And so most organizations don't have the resources to be able to train their own data. So you're relying on somebody else to give you a pre-packaged solution for artificial intelligence, but you don't know what data that they've trained it on. And you're hoping that, because if you go across the internet, so if they're using just a scrape of the entire internet, those of us who've ever spent any time on the internet know sometimes there's good sources, but sometimes there's sources that are people who don't have good intentions. There's people who have conspiracy theories, people who have or might be crazy, all sorts of things. And suddenly their views and perspectives are now in the data that you're using for your artificial intelligence. So that's just something we got to be aware of. So another really important thing, depending on how much you've interacted with an artificial intelligence large language model, is that they're not trained to be coherent. They're supposed to be coherent versus accurate. So what does that mean? Coherent means, can I put together a sentence that is grammatically correct? Does the sentence make sense? It's not trained on whether or not the sentence is true. And so an interesting exercise that you can do on your own is if you have one of the generative AIs, put your own name in there and say, tell me who is Theresa or Terry Grafenstein. And the first time you have to have enough out there for the AI to be able to pull data on you. But if you've ever done public speaking or you've ever been in any type of public-facing position, it'll know who you are. And so if you say, tell me more about Theresa Grafenstein, or give me a resume or a biography of her. And so when I did that for myself, it said that I worked at places I never worked at, which is kind of hilarious. It's like, that's not true. That would have been a neat life experience, but I never worked at, this particular U.S. government agency or wherever it was that it said that I had worked at. And so imagine, so that's just on me. But imagine if you're using that to base some type of work product. So the thing is, you need to make sure you really understand what you're using it for. And it's funny, I put my name in a paid version of a large language model. So it wasn't the free version, that you get for free. I used the paid version. It was wrong. So just be buyer beware. So this is also interesting. So this is out of the news just a few weeks ago. This is a very U.S. focused thing, but this person here is very famous. He was a lawyer for Donald Trump for a number of years, many, many, many years, and he's under a lot of legal pressure. And so he's a very famous lawyer. And what I thought was, so I would imagine very smart, because he's been in a lawyer profession for many, many years. He used a large language model, artificial intelligence, to build part of his case. To defend himself in a lawsuit that's against him. And when he did that, if you've ever looked at any case law or anything where you're building a deposition, you'll always cite legal precedents. This is the other case, another legal case that had a similar type of issue, and this was the outcome. And that way you can show how other judges ruled and what would be in your favor in a very similar case. What was funny, terrible about this situation was that the large language model that he used made up a bunch of fake legal cases. And so he didn't fact check it, and he put it in his actual legal case and put it up through the judge. And the judge came back and said, are you trying to trick us or fool us? None of these legal cases that you're citing even exist. And so that just shows you people are using AI, in ways that can really get them in trouble, because they're putting all this misplaced trust in the accuracy, the correctness of what the AI is generating. So you may think, well, why are these AIs lying, or hallucinating? And another word people use is delusions. So why do artificial intelligence, why are they doing this? And so, we lost our screen. So part of it is that it could be the low quality of the training data. So again, it gets into what model are you using and what type of training data was it, what type of data was it trained on. It could be that, so incorrectly classified or labeled data. So what that means is that all data is going to be metadata tagged. So there's going to be some type of tagging function to say, this is what this picture means, or this is what this unstructured data point means. And the AI is really, really, really looking at the data tagging to help it come to its conclusion. So if you're training it on data that it's not been fact checked, or there's low quality, or there's really poor data tagging, it's going to come to really bad conclusions. Lack of context provided by the user. So a lot of it gets into, in the U.S. they call them prompt engineers. I'm not sure locally what the term is for it, but there's a big business in what's called a prompt engineer, which is, how do I write a structured command in the function for AI to ask it for the right answer. And if you have 2 or 3 people wanting to get to they have the same question in mind, but one person gives it the right context or structures the question in the right way, they're going to get a completely different answer than somebody else who maybe is not using the correct words. And so as you can imagine, depending on, if this passes geographies, if it passes language barriers, all sorts of disconnects that are going to occur, because there are going to be language differences. There's going to be, it's funny, I've interacted with so many Australians over the years, and despite the fact that we allegedly both speak English, there are so many words that the Australians use that I have no idea what they mean. No idea. And so you can imagine, even though we're both English speakers, if we're putting into, a large language model into the structured query, asking a question, and they use a word that is specific to Australian English versus American English, we're going to come up with different answers. And so take that into account even bigger. So if there's between Arabic and English, big difference in the way that we structure our language and the way that we're going to type our queries in. And so again, it's going to be, if people local to this region are using an AI that was trained on heavily Western types of data, that could cause a lot of problems, because it's going to be looking for things that were written by somebody in Western, American, U.S. types of English. And so there's going to be a lot of translation gaps there. And so just understand where your data was trained. So this was, for those of you, I'm not sure if, Terminator, anybody recognize the Terminator? I'm a child of the 80s. Okay, so I wasn't sure if Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, would translate into the local region. But this was a sort of a nightmare, growing up, is when AI and cyborgs would take over the world, and they would kind of crush all the humans into the ground when they took over the place. And so I think secretly in the back of our head, we're all thinking about, well, could this happen? And so it's interesting, late last year, middle of last year, there was a NATO tabletop exercise, and it was open, this is all in the press and stuff, but there was a NATO tabletop exercise where they thought about, well, what would happen if we started using AI for different military types of interventions, or instead of using humans, what would that look like? And so they started thinking about, well, what if it's, you don't want to just launch an artificial intelligence and they just kind of do whatever they want, because you could end up with, our cyborg friends here randomly killing people. So what does this look like? And so they said, well, we would have to have some type of disable switch, some kind of disable command in there. That way, if the AI went Arnold Schwarzenegger crazy rogue, we could make it stop. And so then, as part of the tabletop exercise, they said, okay, so then the AI would, let's launch it. So how does an AI think? In AI, the first thing it would do would be, okay, the mission is to go and execute a bomb or something in this area. How do we? So I'm the AI, and I think, okay, what are the impediments? What are my obstacles from allowing me to complete my mission? Well, step one says there's a kill switch, and the person manning the kill switch is sitting in, pick some, country, state, Arizona, we'll say Pennsylvania, wherever, someplace in the U.S. Well, what the AI would do is, I'm going to go bomb the guy with the kill switch. I'll take the guy out first and sitting in Arizona or Pennsylvania or New York, wherever he's sitting. Okay, check. Now I can go off and do my own thing. And so I think that was an eye-opener, because that was just sort of a tabletop exercise, just people thinking. There's nobody's doing it or anything. It's not real. But they're thinking through some of the things that could potentially happen if you allow an AI to start making decisions that classically humans are making those types of decisions. So the AI would be, let's kill the human first who's controlling my kill switch, and then move forward, which is kind of scary. So it can't all be bad, right? So it's not, I don't want to say all disruption is bad, because if we get behind on disruption, that's when our organizations are no longer relevant. So how do we find that sort of, it's like these rocks here, it's kind of the Zen, how do we find the balance of that? Not getting out ahead where we're implementing AI or some other type of disruptive process or technology so early in the game that we don't really understand the risk, but not waiting so late that our organizations become irrelevant. So as an auditor, we're not the ones putting in the business strategy. But as an auditor, we absolutely should be, we have a seat at the table. And so we absolutely want to be the ones to ask the questions. And so if we're sitting in an executive meeting and our CEO or our executive colleagues are saying, hey, let's put that artificial intelligence, it's going to be able to save us all sorts of money. And even if, as the internal auditors, even if I don't know how the actual algorithm works and I'm not a coder, I still have the obligation to ask questions. And so with if you've ever, any speech I ever do, whether it's cyber, regardless of what the topic is, I always have a slide of, these are the questions, just start with these questions. And so if you ask the question, okay, what are we going to do about AI hallucinations? And all your colleagues at the executive table look at you blankly. That means they haven't thought about it. And that itself is enough to say, I think we need to slow down and think about this. If you ask them the question, what about prompt hijacking? Meaning a prompt is the question that you put in for the large language model. So just like you can have all sorts of hijacking with cyber types of things, what about prompt hijacking? What are the controls in place to make sure that that can't occur? If the people at the table have never heard of that, or they're giving you an answer that sounds sort of like rambling and they're making it up, that's a problem, right? Unauthorized changes to the model. So, AIs are incredibly complicated, and they're sitting on top of a model. And so just think about old school IT auditing, where we would want to make sure that people check the program in and out before it goes into production. We're talking all the way back to COBOL. I mean, that's just a standard thing. You're using that same logic, it's just on a large language model. So what are we doing to protect that model from somebody changing the code? Because if I change your code, I own your organization. Because AI, to be useful, have to have access to all of your data, right? And so if I can get into your model, I own you. So you need to make sure that there's controls in place and that somebody's thought about how do I make sure that this doesn't happen. Inappropriate responses, we already talked about that. You don't want to have this publicly facing and have it saying things about your organization that you don't want to have them say. Leakage of PII or sensitive data. So one of the big risks about AI is people in your companies, your organizations, will sometimes, to make their jobs easier, and it's not malicious, but they'll take whole parts of your company's data and they'll feed it into a large language model function to see if it'll analyze the data and spit the data out. Well, now your PII or your customers or your constituents' data is now out in the internet. So what controls are in place for that? Biased output. I talked about that a little bit when I talked about the difference between U.S. English or Australian or Arabic or English in terms of being able to structure the prompts. But think about the biased output in terms of just different cultures. So as they start building in like video functions and graphics and that sort of thing, if the AI has been trained on heavily Western data, and you say to the AI, and really just a simple example would be, give me a picture of a bride on the day of her wedding. And so if it's been trained on heavily Western data, that bride is going to look a certain way with a white gown and a veil, but it's not going to translate to all cultures, which is bias, right? And that makes it's going to make it less useful for different regions. And so you just have to be aware of that. Copyright violations, IP theft. The AI doesn't care about copyright. They don't care about that. And so for those of us in organizations, we know that there's legal repercussions if I go out and take data from my competitor's website, or if I take data from somewhere where there's a copyright. The AI doesn't understand that. If it has access to it, it could be in the data that it's giving to you. So you need to make sure that you understand that there's somebody, you have to have somebody that's really looking for those types of things to ensure that your organization doesn't get into a legal battle. Unauthorized deployment of AI into production. This is the big one. So for those of you I'm definitely IT auditors is how I came up. So there's since the beginning of time, IT, we always struggle with shadow IT, meaning people who create their own user version of a larger technology. So ideally, you would want your Chief Information Officer to own all of your IT. That way they can control it. They can make sure that it's been appropriately patched, that it has multi-factor authentication, that there are controls over who can make changes. But in the world of AI, and cloud, by the way, the same thing goes for cloud here, but in the world of AI and cloud, anybody can go out and spin up a cloud instance in your organization. just a credit card. They'll say, oh, I want to buy some Microsoft Azure services or Amazon Cloud, AWS. And they're spinning up a cloud environment. They can do the same thing with AI, depending on what controls you have in place to prevent them from installing that on your platform. So imagine if they do that and they start doing things behind the scenes. And a lot of times they're not being malicious. They're just trying to do it to make their jobs easier. They see it as a tool. But we need to make sure that there are controls to prevent them from doing that, so that way when we do use AI or cloud in our environments, that we're doing it in a controlled way. So resilience. So resilience is something that no matter what, it applies to AI, it applies to cyber, it applies to any disruptive event. COVID, ransomware, anything. So the goal is, if something does happen, good or bad, that's disruptive to your organization, it's all about how quickly can you get back into full operating model. So this is just a definition. I've shared my slide, but this is just a definition of what resilience is. It's the ability to withstand attacks, whether it's natural, man-made. It's the ability to get back to normal. So many of you, if you have a tech background, you may think, oh, resilience is just a fancy new way to do business continuity. It's different, though, because old school business continuity, disaster recovery, resilience is like that, but it's the next generation. So if something disrupts and you have to recover, old school business continuity, disaster recovery would look at the impact to my organization. Whereas if I'm coming from financial services, and so depending on how large your organization is, you have to think and step back, how does this potentially impact society? So if you're a government organization or you're somebody who's providing services to, for the society, how does this impact society? It's moving from a tech problem to a business problem, and that's a big leap. This becomes more of a business problem. An individual recovery time versus end-to-end. And one of the things you'll find with resilience is really going from these little micro looks at things to really understanding what you do, why it's important, and how it starts to when it finishes. So an end-to-end view. And you'll see, I use the term, the acronym E to E in here, end-to-end, which just means beginning to end. And so on and so forth. So it's basically moving our models after disruptive event to really understand our processes end-to-end and what are the important things that we're doing. So how do you do that? So one of the things, if you really want to get resilience, disruption proof, you have to go through your organization and decide, what are my critical business services? What are the most important things that I do that if they went out, they went dark, it would bring my organization down? And that's you may think you know what the answer is to this. It's a really hard exercise because everybody wants to think what they do is the most important. And so if you get all these executives in the room, they're all like, no, my stuff's the most important. And so for you to come down with a list of, say, 25 things, you don't want to lose sight of things like, okay, you want to get the public-facing, the revenue-generating types of processes end-to-end, but you also want to look at things like identity and access management. How do I make sure that people actually have access to, my workers have access to the systems? That's a pretty important process, but it's behind the scenes. But it's really making sure that you understand what the most important things are, so that way you can prioritize them to really protect them from a disruptive event. So after you come up with all your really, really important processes and you're trying to think, how do we protect these from a disruptive event? When I think about, I started off as a financial statement auditor many, 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 many years ago. And so one of the very first steps you do in a financial statement audit is you map the process, because you really want to understand what all the controls are. That's how you would do this. So if you say that my most important process, if you're in financial services, is to deliver some banking product to my my member, my customer, client, and what does that mean? And so you have to map it from the very beginning to the very end. And as you're mapping that, as you get more mature and really understanding what causes disruption, you start thinking about those end-to-end business services in terms of, does it cross geographies? Does it cross departments? Most of your big control gaps occur when when one team hands a process off to the next team. All the teams always think the other person did this, or I thought you were doing that. And so you want to make sure that you're not only looking at crossing departments, but crossing geographies. That could be within your own country, or it could be across international boundaries. And as you're going across international boundaries with your process, depending on if you're a international, multinational type of organization, you have to start thinking about, as you're mapping out these critical services, what are the data protection laws that are in place? If I have a disruptive event and I'm based in this country, but I need to shift it, say I'm based in Egypt and I need to shift it to India or somewhere else because the site is out here, what are some of the legal ramifications in shifting it to India or shifting it to the UK or wherever you want to shift it? What are the legal ramifications? And until you really understand what your critical services are, what happens is disruption occurs in whatever form it is, and you're thinking about it as you're running and as you're trying to get things fixed. You're never going to make good choices when you're in a frantic sort of recovery mode. As you're thinking about disruption, are there a history of different, earthquakes, or their history of really big, weather events that you might want to take into account? What about geopolitical risk? Is this an area that has a heightened tension for this particular type of geopolitical risk or that type of geopolitical risk? And what does that mean to my organization? Do I need to have a fail-safe so that way if something happens in where my organization is, that I can quickly move it somewhere else so that way you're not disrupted? The other thing is, as you're layering on and you really understand your critical services, reliance on third parties, that is some of your biggest cyber threats and some of your biggest cyber events in the last few years. They don't go after your organization, they go after your third-party supplier now. And so what happens if you're relying on a third party, your critical service is relying on some big third party? What happens if that third party is breached or has some major disruption or they go out of business? How are you gonna adapt to that? Concentration risk, and for those of us in financial services, that means something very specific. It means, where are all my customers in a specific geography, or are they all in a specific line of business? So if all my customers are based in Silicon Valley and something bad happens to the tech industry, something bad's going to happen to my business model. But that same idea of concentration risk can go to any industry, because your concentration risk is different than mine, but you still have the potential for concentration risk. Reliance on transportation of physical objects. And that one sounds weird. So as you're mapping out these end-to-end processes and you're layering on the different things to think about that could disrupt them, there's certain things like, so for example, during COVID, one of the things that we hadn't pre-thought in the organization I was at the time was you reliance on a third party, but they needed a physical token to be able to do multi-factor authentication. But how do I get to them if all of the borders are shut down and all the customs processes are shut down and my multi-factor authentication tokens are sitting in customs in country X? That was a tough spot to be in, because suddenly you get disrupted massively because we didn't pre-think we need to have things staged there. And so just getting ahead of all these things helps you to become more resilient proof. And as the auditors, these are the questions, regardless if it's about AI or cyber or pick your disruptive event, these are the kinds of questions you need to think about as you're talking to your business stakeholders. Have we thought about these? Do we know what the critical things are that we do? How could we be disrupted, and how can we protect ourselves? I think this is my last slide. So I wanted to end my session on talking about using AI or machine learning or natural language processing within the internal audit function. And so at this point, I think it's probably, because our organizations are using AI in a very sort of, nervous type of thing. I think it's still a little early for whole, internal audit functions to say, oh, we're an AI fluent organization. It's kind of hard for us to get ahead of our organizations. But there are absolutely ways that we can be using them, and I know that I use them. So for machine learning, which from my perspective is like one notch lower than for real generative AI. And so the ways that I use them are, I use it in financial services. You have different regulators that post consumer complaints. And so if you're in the consumer banking industry, it's really important to understand the types of consumer complaints that are coming in. And so instead of having an auditor going out and reading all these consumer complaints, because the consumer complaints drive, the regulators, U.S. regulators will fine, big dollar fines. And so it's good to go out and use these natural language processing programs to scan the different websites, tell me what are the big themes of these consumer complaints, and then I add those types of controls to my audit programs. I've also, when we receive various letters that go to our chairman or go to the audit committee chair about either concerns, good or bad, about the organization, we're using that to also look at root cause analysis. Is there something that is causing these types of concerns, and do I have the right controls in place? The other part, root cause analysis, and using NLPs to do this, I look at the history of all my audit recommendations and I say, am I missing the big picture? Because sometimes auditors can get so in the weeds and so detailed and looking at things issue by issue by issue that we don't realize there's this really big type of root cause that's driving all these problems. And if I fix this one root cause, it would get rid of all these symptoms that are occurring that show up in my other audit issues. And so with that, I'm going to end on a quote. It says, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to act with yesterday's logic." And that's like, we need to make sure that we're proactive as internal audit professionals and that we're engaged and that we're really helping to disruption-proof our organizations. With that, I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you so much for including me today.